Hello and welcome to the Cloud Chronicles. Today, John Morehouse and I are going to talk about Azure Firewall. I'm Joey Dantoni. I'm Principal Cloud Architect at 3Cloud, and I'll let John introduce himself.
Hi, all. My name is John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant at Dantoni and Associates, and I love firewalls.
Azure Firewall has a lot of powerful features, and we're going to talk about some kind of best practices for network security. We're also going to compare, Azure Firewall to some of the other services you might know, like network security groups and I think some of the web application firewall stuff we talked about when we talked about App Gateway and Front Door in the last episode. So let's talk about Azure Firewall. What is Azure Firewall besides being kind of an expensive network service? It can protect your cloud resources, but that's really any firewall. Network security groups can do that too. I think really where you start to get into some good use cases for Azure Firewall is as your network gets bigger and you need to have centralized policy management or hybrid networks. John, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so I know I'm old school because I'm old and have been around for many, many decades. I always consider even an Azure firewall, like I always remember or think back to like the days where we had a Cisco firewall in a
Mm-hmm.
rack, and that was the main gateway to the public internet and also into our corporate personal network or private networks. In Azure, it's the same thing. You know, that's how I equate that firewall. It's the moat around your network that you want to protect very thoroughly.
Yeah,
So
and,
that's how
and
I
there
kind
are
of think
other
about it.
firewalls available, and it's kind of interesting. So the third-party firewalls you're going to get, and we're not really going to talk about those other than this. Like you can get a Cisco firewall, you can get a Barracuda, or
Sure.
take your favorite vendor. Those are VM appliances, but you're pretty much going to implement them the same way. So one of the things we're going to show is I've built a firewall on our demo network, and we're going to demo that and walk through how you configure it. But you always end up having to create a user-defined route for from a subnet to that firewall, and you can create one route and share that. I think the other thing that's really powerful about Azure Firewall, and this is going to also apply to those third-party ones, but it gives you a centralized place to do firewall management, uh, and that's something we don't always see. Like some of the other solutions, and I asked Matt for a picture of his race car, but he didn't have one, so I found one online. But in a car, a firewall is to separate you from the heat and noise of the engine. In computer networks, a firewall is designed to separate you from the noise and pollution of the internet. And you'll notice there are some holes in that firewall because we do have to get things through. And that's kind of what we're going to design and talk about the various rules. John, what does Azure Firewall cost?
So it depends on the tier. There are a couple different SKUs that you can do with Azure Firewall. The the cheapest is probably around 300 bucks. And that's going to be the basic SKU for Azure Firewall. We can go all the way up to like $1,300, $1,400, depending on what you need. So it ranges. It's not necessarily the cheapest thing in Azure, but if you deploy multiple firewalls, it could be the most more expensive
Yeah,
for
yeah,
you.
yeah. It can be pricey.
It can be pricey.
Yeah, and you do have to pay for traffic too. The traffic isn't
Yep,
hugely expensive. It's about $16 a month per terabyte, or $16 per terabyte. Generally, there's not really a
that's not
ton of it.
horrible. I mean, today's standard 16 bucks for a terabyte is not
Yeah, yeah, it's
a
kind of
network
standard
traffic. I mean, that's a
network
lot of
traffic.
network traffic.
And much like a lot of features, as you go larger, you may need to have, as your cloud networking solution grows, you may need to have multiple Azure firewalls. So here we have an example, and this is kind of the way we have this set up here, where we have a couple of spokes that are hanging off the Azure firewall. This is the standard model, which is the mid-tier pricing, which is about $900 a month. And you have Microsoft Threat Intelligence. It's going to automatically block malicious IPs and domain names. And one of the things to note here is that is a key difference between Azure firewalls and network security groups. If you're not familiar with network security groups, you can apply those at the subnet level within your virtual networks. They're very much kind of a manual operation where you're defining things. And the kind of a really other key difference is they only work off of IP addresses and IP address ranges. So one of the things that we're going to demo later is maybe allowing Azure Firewall to allow you your VNets to have traffic out to Windows Update. If you were using NSGs, you would have to find the IP addresses for Windows Update and then add those to your allow list. with Firewall, you can just specify star.update.windows.net or whatever the URL is handy. It is something. Have you seen anybody use Firewall in conjunction with NSGs? Because that's something I've seen a little bit.
I have seen that.
Yeah.
It all depends on everybody's individual topology of how they want their network to be laid out. But I have seen NSGs in place.
And mostly when I've seen that anyway, it's been like using some NSGs for some private traffic filtering and like letting Azure Firewall handle all the public stuff. Whereas like you have a SQL subnet and you only want to allow 1433 inbound from a specific subnet. That's kind of where I've seen that with.
And like we have a client that has NSGs in place for that very purpose, right? They've limited access to certain subnets from their on-premise office. And so they use NSGs to help block that.
Oh, wait, I had a slide on the tiers. I forgot about this. Let's share that.
We should share that, yes.
Yeah. So Basic is designed for, so there are kind of two parts of these. They're feature driven too, but they're also scale driven. Basic is really designed for small, medium business customers. It doesn't have a lot of that fancy URL filtering, and it only goes up to 250 megabits per second. There's a standard tier, which is suitable. This is your main firewall. This is mostly if you're implementing firewall, you're probably going to go standard. But there's not a huge difference in cost between standard and premium. Yeah, so standard is the core firewall product, and premium kind of adds on threat intelligence, which is pretty similar to what like Azure Defender adds on. So it's combination of features, but that's the basic idea of all these service tiers. And like I say, Basic's way cheap, standard and premium are pretty close in price. So depending on your needs, here we mentioned financial applications. Like I think that's probably a PCS requirement.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, let's talk about some of the features like rule collections. You want to talk a little bit about rule collections and how that works? Because I think that's really a key element here.
Well, so a rule collection is just that. It's a group of rules, and it's the first thing that the firewall processes. And so typically it follows a priority order based on the values. So when traffic comes in, it'll evaluate that traffic against the rules in those groups, and then decide where that traffic needs to go or block it or do something with it.
And those rules are, if you've ever worked with any kind of a firewall type product, it's universal. The rules are evaluated on the order of the number increasing, and blocks always overrule denies. And that's, or blocks always overrule denies. Blocks always overrule allows. Like if I have a rule that's got a priority of 1 and I say block traffic on port 443, and then I have another rule that's got a priority of 5 that says allow traffic on 443, that block rule is going to win.
Well, and that's also very common with like NSGs, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got experience dealing with NSGs like VMs, and you allow a port 3389, which is RDP, you set that as a higher priority than your denies. So if you're comfortable with doing that in NSGs, the firewall operates in the same capacity.
Yeah, and not just NSGs there. That's really like something that it's kind of universal across like network rules. So like in any network, if you've used a firewall, you're probably familiar with some of this stuff.
Yeah. I will say that I had more experience with NSGs before I started playing around with firewalls. So my experience into the Azure space, NSGs were more prevalent because they get stood up when you create a VM. So I had more experience with that than dealing with firewalls.
Yeah, for sure. And really, firewalls just let you aggregate this stuff, whereas NSGs, you would have to kind of define that at every subnet. And typically, if you're using NSGs like that at scale, you've hopefully done some infrastructure at code. So your NSG rules just get applied based on your subnet names. But if you don't, even then, that's still kind of a manual process. Whereas with rule collections, you can kind of apply those across all of your firewall rules. We also have threat intelligence filtering, and this is kind of something that is really where the intelligence of Azure Firewall comes in. So it allows customers to essentially govern and log all of their traffic flows and block specific egress tracking. They can block suspicious sites, just by enabling this. And you can enable threat intelligence filtering for your firewall based on malicious IP addresses, fully qualified domains, and URLs. Microsoft, with their Defender product and their threat intelligence feed, they source what those malicious sites and IPs are. And that's really powered by the intelligence security graph and that cyber intelligence team. So really kind of powerful security built-in features. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the third-party solutions have this too. Microsoft, I will say, from a threat intelligence perspective, they've had their security foibles in Azure, but their threat intelligence is really good. They've identified a lot of 0 days and nation state kind of type attackers that have been going after it. So it's a place I really trust their security. So this is a really powerful implementation that they kind of have there. Let's kind of dive in and take a look at firewall. So I have a firewall here, and we're going to navigate and kind of walk you through a couple of things. One of the things about a firewall is you'll note it has a private IP, but it also has a public IP because it's got to have that inbound traffic. It does there are a couple of subnets you have to create. So I've built this in our hub network, and let's navigate over there. And if we go into our subnet, you'll see I have to have a subnet called Azure Firewall subnet and an Azure Firewall Management subnet. By the way, this is something that kind of a subnet pattern that your hub's probably going to look like and should, as we've been talking about this hub and spoke, because there are some specific services. John, isn't MI one where you have to have
MI's got its own subnet.
Yeah.
Bastion has its own subnet.
Yeah, there are some services in Azure where you have to have this specific subnet name or the service won't create. So if we pop back to the firewall, we see we have that management subnet. We have the management public IP. We also have the public IP for the firewall. So to create this, you have to have 2 public IP addresses. And then we see the virtual network name. Where we manage everything, we don't do a whole lot in this firewall screen other than we can change the SKU. There are some settings so you can configure, but everything is driven through Firewall Manager, which you'd think would be linked from that button, and it's not. So here we see firewall rules. We only have one VNet protected by our Azure Firewall because I didn't configure everything. We also don't have virtual DDoS configured. That's an expensive one. I think we're talking about that in our next episode. We can see our app gateway protection, but let's pop back into our spoke because I want to show you how you map back to an Azure Firewall and virtual networks. I mapped ADDS in. So here we have this network and we have this subnet. Subnet's called ADDS. If you're not familiar with Windows Server, Active Directory Domain Services, I have this route table, and this is kind of the key element here. This route table maps to, and let's see, I think I can edit this, but no, I can't edit it. This route table maps to this address, which is our the private IP address of our firewall, and the next hop is a virtual appliance. And then the next hop from there is the 000 represents the internet. So basically any traffic from this subnet is going to go to that virtual appliance and then out to the internet. You can create one route table and use it across everything, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure you can. So like that route, once I have it defined. In a route table, by the way, this is a little weird. It's its own, this is the screen I was trying to get you. It's its own resource. So like here, if I go to route tables, we can kind of see that. I also have a firewall rule for firewalls to subnets. I don't actually have this implemented. Where you need a second firewall or a second route table for your firewall rule is if you have multiple firewalls in different regions and you want to go cross for high availability. You need to have a route table for your firewall subnets too, so that they can kind of talk to each other. But if we go back into Firewall Manager, which should be linked from there, but isn't, we can see our virtual networks. We can see they're peered to a virtual hub. We don't actually have a virtual hub because this is virtual WAN. And then we can drive into Azure Firewall policies. And this policy can be used across firewalls. And this is where we're going to start to set our rules. I don't have any rules defined yet, but we're gonna do a few here just to kind of walk you through the process. So you can set up a rule collection, and I'm going to set up a rule collection group. And of course, I can't put a space in that. And we'll make this 100. And the first thing we're going to do is create a network rule to allow traffic for DNS. Let's see, add rule, or add a rule collection. And we'll make this our highest priority rule, because if DNS doesn't work, we're in bad shape. And I can add this to my rule collection group. And we're saying allow. We're going to call this rule allow DNS. I think it's kind of a best practice to when you call a rule, say what if it's allow or block, and then what feature it is. We're going to say UDP TCP 53, and then we're going to specify. Do you know the other Google one? Is it 4.
It's 8.8
and 4.4.
4.4.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. No, 8.8.4.4.
No, I think it's 8.8.8.
Yeah, that's the first one, and there's a secondary at 8.8.4.4.
Okay. And these are two Google ones. Like ideally, what you want to do is probably have a second DNS vendor. So, I forgot to put in my source, and we're just going to say star there, and then we'll add that rule. No, it's doing something. Oh, our other rule, our rule
Still
collection is still deploying. Not everything is super fast in the land of firewall. That's the basic idea. But let's go ahead and we'll also add another rule that will probably fail. But let's do it anyway.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, our network. Okay, we actually have. We'll make this 120, and we'll do DNS again. Staging these demos is difficult because sometimes there's a lot of things that take a little while to. And we'll do UDP and TCP. 53.
Thinking about you're allowing DNS through the firewall, another thing that you might have to allow is like Windows updates.
We're going to do that. That's
nice.
That was the best kind of question, because we're going to do that later. The other thing we're going to do is allow Azure storage here. So we're going to say allow. Let me kill these. We know this is okay.
So this is where you have to think about what external traffic do you want to allow, such as DNS or Azure storage or Windows updates.
Yeah, and so here we're going to say TCP 443. And instead of IP address, we can either use a storage tag, or we can just use storage.azure.com. Service tags will allow you to map to a specific service in a specific region. I didn't enable DNS proxy on the firewall. But yeah, you get the basic idea there of how that works. Yeah, so we're going to apply this policy and probably wait 10 minutes.
Well, we wait for that. Can you go back to the firewall manager?
Yeah.
You had talked about like regional things. I think it's worth noting that if you go to
let me just navigate back over there.
Yeah.
We have operations in progress.
Like one of the things I've always somewhat struggled with is like, how do you make this redundant for clients that want firewalls? But if you just do a standard IP with on the external IP address of the firewall, you actually get it zone redundancy. So if you go into the settings, you can actually see.
Sorry, yeah, you actually wanted firewall, I think.
Oh, firewall. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you go to the properties.
Yeah, the public IP. Yeah, regional.
Well, if you go back to the firewall.
Okay.
Go to the properties under settings.
I did not deploy into an availability zone because I was cheap. You do have
that's fine. But here, like you could actually, if you deployed a standard IP address, you would get you'd get the firewall or the IP address in all 3 zones of your region if it has availability zones.
Yeah, and the firewall service itself is highly available.
Yes. Yeah, but I think that's something worth to note as people deploy firewalls, that if you deploy the right IP address, you get zone redundancy out of the gate. Because I want to make sure that my firewall stays up for my clients.
So one of the things we had to do was enable DNS proxy on our firewall in order to support fully qualified domain names. So let's do some network rules. We'll make this 110. We're going to go into our baseline rules. And you'll note there are some rule collection groups there. Those are the default ones. You can't change those. They always exist. We're going to say allow from all of ours TCP and UDP. Port 53, which is DNS, and we're going to say 8.8.8, 8.8.4.4.
Oh, you got a queue in there.
Yep. And now we're gonna allow outbound to Windows storage, or Azure storage.
So that's Google DNS. What other DNS provider do you like?
I usually use one Google and one Cloudflare.
Yeah, that's about what I use too. There's a couple different open providers that you could use: Cloudflare, Google.
Weren't you experimenting with like OpenDNS or?
Yeah, OpenDNS I think has one.
Yeah. Don't do this for allow rules, kids. Where you're doing star, 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 that's not good. It's fine for deny. I give up.
You get the idea, though.
You get the idea.
Yeah.
This isn't something you're supposed to do on the fly. Anyway, enough of fumbling through demos. Have you seen any misconfigurations that can cause problems?
I haven't, because typically I usually have Denny double check me.
Yeah.
And that's worth noting that if you're not, you can screw that up, right?
Yeah.
And given the firewall is the gateway to your infrastructure in Azure, it might be worthwhile having somebody like Joey or Denny or somebody in your organization just to double check to make sure everything's kosher, because otherwise it could be detrimental.
Yeah, firewall rules are something you don't want to, for multiple reasons, you don't want to just willy-nilly implement, because you can open something bad.
You don't want to.
And bad guys can get in. Or B, you can like block some critical service that you didn't realize was happening. One of the things, and we always go back to this, but the Azure networking tool set, you always want to use those things. If you're seeing something that's blocked that you don't think should be blocked, use that networking tool set. It will do a good job of telling you what's going on to be able to identify. The other thing too, you want to make sure you have those route tables in place so all your traffic is routing through the firewall. Back to the infrastructure as code thing, that's something you probably want to have in your network templates, where you just automatically have that route table associated with any new subnets that get created. Let's talk a little bit about security and logging and scaling here. Scaling mostly just kind of happens automatically for you, so that's not a big concern. But there are some kind of interesting things around ways you can configure security, because we just kind of configured a baseline set of rules there. But maybe, John, let's talk about how you could do that for various teams, because like maybe you have teams that have different network requirements.
Like an application team policy?
Yeah, like a dev team.
Yeah, so I've never actually gone that route. Like I've never created one of those policies, but you could create that in theory, like in my head. You could create that policy and then inherit the base policy along with it. So you could do application team specific policies for that firewall. If a team needed to get routed out to a specific spot or what have you, you could apply that rule for that specific team.
Yeah, and you can tie those into Intra, right? So like
Yep.
you can create custom roles to provide that fine-grained access.
Have
Like
you seen that, like an application team policy actually be deployed?
I haven't seen it done in Azure Firewall. We did it at Comcast. Like
I mean, it
I
makes
was
sense.
on the
I have never seen that actually deployed in Azure.
yeah no, but we had like multiple firewall policies. So like I was in the privilege team.
So
Uh,
you got to, yeah. I never got to be in the privilege team.
yeah,
Somebody else handled that. So
it always helps when the domain admin, the head domain admin, is like on your team.
yeah, well, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yes. So we had access to everything, and like your security team may have like a completely different set of rules. Your developers may have a completely different set of rules. Like typically, one of the things with network security is developers always want to do like developers and hackers basically do the same thing on computers. Like your developers aren't trying to hack everything, but like a lot of the things developers end up doing look like hacking activity. So a lot of times you might try to isolate your your hackers, your developers to their own network. That's one of the reasons why things like Azure DevBox are so popular because you can kind of isolate those teams into specific areas, so they aren't like maybe your developers are even like in a different network segment than your business users. Uh, and with like in a large enterprise, you may have different access configured to different SaaS applications. Like if you want to block SaaS applications, which is kind of a common thing I see in some organizations, you have only allowances for specific groups.
Hmm.
Wow,
Makes sense.
that was a lot in firewall and lots of troubleshooting, like we always like to do.
Live and demos.
Live and demos, yeah. No recorded demos in this video series because I refuse to do recorded demos. I mean, they are recorded, but they're live as we're doing them. Uh, I will say one of the things that's interesting about firewall is I don't think of like all the Azure services we talk about. The docs here aren't super awesome. There is a lot of documentation that the team has put together, but a lot of it's in like community blog posts. So make sure to broaden your search beyond just learnmicrosoft.com if you're trying to learn about this. Uh, it is kind of an expensive service to try, but the basic tier is pretty cheap if you just want to start playing with rules and kind of understanding how network flows work. Uh, Anything else about the service? Did we talk? I know we brought this up in pre-show, but did we talk about the difference between WAF and
No, actually,
no?
it's like you know what I was going to ask because I
Yeah,
think that we should talk about that because it's
yeah.
a little bit
Go
different.
ahead.
Well, so in my opinion, so a WAF is a web application firewall,
Which
and
we talked about in the last episode with
yep,
App Gateway. Yeah,
yep, and so it sits on the app gateway, and its purpose is really to protect the web apps behind that app gateway. And so I think that we get a little bit more like T-SQL injection protection,
SQL injection, not
or
T.
SQL injection. Sorry, not T-SQL. SQL injection protection with that WAF. And so in my head, topology, the firewall again is that moat around the castle.
Mhm.
It protects the entire infrastructure, whereas the WAF just protects that web app behind it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a little bit different, but it does the same kind of thing, but it's a
Yeah,
little bit different beast.
to speak in like database parlance, you use like a time series database a lot of times for logging, and you would never use a relational database for that because of the overhead of like writing to a transaction log and stuff. A web
Yeah.
application firewall is just a really specialized kind of firewall that only does a handful of things, whereas like your Azure firewall is going to do everything, but it doesn't do that cross-site scripting check, like it's really specific. So like the compute on a WAF is a little bit higher, but it's not doing as many things. So yeah, they're
Both
different.
important though.
Yeah, different tools for different jobs,
Yep.
and you kind of need both. Uh, as always, like when you're dealing with network edge security, belt and suspenders is a good approach. Having multiple tools in your belt is very handy.
Yep. Agreed.
Cool. I hope you learned a lot about Azure Firewall. The next episode, I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the other Azure security features and networking, like DDoS and some of the things that I can't afford. And probably a little bit more on WAFs too, just to go into detail of like how they work specifically, because we've covered them at a high level. Anything else you'd like to add?
Nope. I still love firewalls.
Yeah, I look forward to. And John and I are going to see each other next week at a VP Summit, and we're going to learn a bunch of stuff we probably won't be able to talk about for like 3 months. But
I think. Are you speaking at FabCon?
Yeah, I am speaking
Yeah.
at FabCon.
Yeah, me too. So
We're
we'll
both
be in
going to be
Vegas.
talking kind of about various topics around Fabric database. SQL database on Fabric.
Yep.
I can never remember that name.
Yep.
Thanks,
SQL
Microsoft.
database. Is it on Fabric or in Fabric?
In Fabric, I think.
I don't remember. But SQL database,
The Fabric database.
Fabric
Right?
SQL database.
Yeah.
So if you're in Vegas, I assume that this will. When are we?
This will go live the first day of FabCon. So if you're in Vegas,
Okay, cool.
come
So
say
if you're in
hi to
Vegas,
us.
and you see this video, come see us.
Yeah.
We would love to talk to you.
All right. Like and subscribe, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
See you next
Bye.
time.
Okay, stop.